Everyone, welcome to lecture 7. So this is the last lecture for the first half of the class. And so what that means for you is that this is the last of the lecture material that will be covered on the midterm exam. Every lecture beyond this point will be included on the final exam. So after you're done with the midterm, you can absolutely forget everything I've taught you in any one of these lectures over. I hope you don't, but you won't need them for the final exam there. So today we're going to talk about the presidency and bureaucracy. So as you remember, the organization of this course was thoughts and ideas on paper, thoughts and ideas in a constitution, institutions created by that constitution. And this is the last one that we're going to cover, which is the executive branch or the presidency. But we also include discussion of the bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy here, because the bureaucracy falls under the purview of the president. So it's directly under the executive branch here. So let's go ahead and dig in. So it's Article 2 of the Constitution that specifically outlines the requirements for executive power to rest with a president of the United States. So going way back here, you'll remember that the anti-federalists were like, hey, remember all those issues that we had with the King of England? Now you guys want to create basically a king and a different name that we select. The Federalists were like, yeah, that'll balance essentially some of the other branches of the government here, and we'll have, three different systems to kind of pass good legislation and stuff. So if you look at what the Constitution says about the president, it requires the president to be a natural-born citizen and at least 35 years of age. Outlines the means of selecting the president, sorta. We'll talk about that here in a second. Identifies the president as commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So, this is an interesting little sort of tidbit. It's not something we think about. So there are places in the world, particularly in South America, Latin America, where the military is separate from the executive branch or executive leadership of the country, and you tend to see military coups. So you see, very powerful generals saying, I don't like the direction things are going, and I've got all these tanks and fighter jets and stuff, so maybe I can change things. We in the United States try to prohibit that by making the president the commander-in-chief, so head of all of the military branches. That's why when the president exits Air Force One or something, he gets a salute because he's technically the top commander in the military for all the branches. And also the Constitution lays out the grounds for removing or impeaching a president, which we've discussed a little bit to this point here. So let's talk about the Electoral College. And depending on your respective age and how long you've been around or how much you were paying attention in 2020, you may be familiar with the Electoral College here. So we talked about sort of in the foundation of the Constitution and the debates that were going back and forth between the delegates from the different states. There were a lot of different compromises that were reached. As one of those compromises is that the Constitution does not permit the direct election of presidents by voters. So we don't technically elect the president of the United States directly. Instead, each state maintains a number of electoral votes equal to their House and Senate representatives. So states have various methods of choosing electors, but typically rely on partisan methods. So whoever's in charge of the legislature will choose the electors there. So you have these actual individuals, these electors, who are duty bound to cast their ballot for the candidate who wins the vote in that state based on the various state rules. And so that's one of the things I've tried to drive home in this class is that because the Constitution doesn't specify how federal elections should be carried out, that is a reserve power to the states. And it's the reason why we have so much state control and so much variety in different methods and practices. And that's why state legislatures are so active in trying to control voting. This past week, I saw that Republicans in North Carolina are trying to change, basically the election system for county commissioners in Wake County, only in Wake County, to make them nonpartisan elections, so they wouldn't have, Republican or Democrat next to their name or an R or a D. There is an electoral advantage in doing that for them in rural areas where they tend to get urban areas where they tend to get their butts handed to them. They're not looking to do this in rural areas because they already win those handily here. That's an example of how state governments have tremendous power over not only state elections, but local and federal as well here. So you have these electors. They can technically, and this has happened before, where you have an elector who, let's say you're in. I'm looking at my map to remember states, as if I can't remember different states. So let's say you're in Michigan, and Joe Biden won Michigan in 2020. You, as an elector, based on that system where the president who wins that state, the popular vote, gets all the electoral votes. Well, you decide, well, I'm going to give it to Trump because I'm a Trump loyalist, and if I get arrested, he's going to pardon me because he's coming back into office anyways. Different states have different rules about that. So some states that may be a criminal charge. In fact, that came up in a few cases in 2020 there. Others, you basically just don't get selected to be an elector in the future. The good news, depending on how you look at it, is that while this has happened in the past, has never actually swayed an election. That it wouldn't want to be around the next morning if it ever did. That would be tricky. So let's talk about these electoral votes here. So 48 of the states in this great union give all their electoral college votes to the candidate winning the highest share of votes in that state. The only two that don't, Nebraska and Maine, they have proportional electoral college systems. So you basically get electoral votes based on the percentage of the seats that you win. So if for instance, Nebraska has 5 electoral college votes. If a candidate wins 80% of the vote in Nebraska, they'll win 4 electoral votes. One of those will go to the person who got the other 20%, for instance. There are 538 total electoral votes. Where does that number come from? It's equivalent to the number of House seats that each state has plus the number of Senate seats here. So you can see on a state-by-state basis on the map here how that breaks out. So North Carolina in 2020, we had 15 electoral college votes. That was one for the 13 congressional districts in North Carolina, and then one each for the 2 Senate seats there. Now, the using this electoral college system gives a natural advantage, a slight one, to smaller states, right? Because there are a lot of states, we'll use North Dakota, for instance, where they only have 1 congressional district. The entire state is a single congressional district because not a lot of people live there. But then they get 2 for each of the Senate seats. So again, it was that compromise between states' rights and for anti-federalists and the Federalists and sort of how they wanted to run things here. Now, what this produces is, you'll get, if you're on social media, you'll see, for instance, these maps people post where they show, things like this, where they're like, look at all that red. How can you tell me that Joe Biden won when, how much of the country has, gotten behind, President Trump? Well, a lot of those are places that not a lot of people live, right? So if you see, again, these electoral college votes are largely proportional to population. California has the largest population in the United States. They had 55 electoral college votes. And you can sort of see how this breaks out. What this means, and we'll talk about when we get into voting in elections, there's different strategies applied. For instance, I don't think that Joe Biden ever went to California during the 2020 election cycle because he was going to win it. And so his resources were better utilized in other places. Whereas, Donald Trump, for instance, I don't know how many trips he made to, Texas, for instance, although Texas ended up being a little closer than would have thought. But he was kind of a shoo-in to win Texas or states like Idaho. They're not going to go to Idaho because you're going to win it. You're going to go to places like North Carolina, which he did frequently, or places like Ohio and Florida and that sort of thing here. So this is how it works. We basically elect the president who receives a majority, at least 270 of these electoral college votes. Now, you could have a situation where, let's say you have a viable third-party candidate and they jump in the race and they win a couple states, and nobody gets 270. Well, that becomes a tricky situation because essentially it becomes the legislature becomes Congress who selects the president. And again, another thing I hope doesn't happen because that would probably initiate a lot of frustration and anger, depending on what side and is where and who gets selected. Oh, here's the duck. He says, I'm sorry, what? I thought the American people voted for the president. I literally remember filling out a ballot and choosing. So yes, you fill out a ballot, you circle the person that you want to win, but technically you just voted for who your state's electors will choose. The Constitution doesn't specify how elections should be carried out. States are free to devise their own system. That's why you have different states will procure with, right now we're in the midst of the Dominion voting lawsuit against Fox News and Trump and Rudy Giuliani and several other folks. And that was based on the fact that Dominion contracted with several states to basically electronically run their elections through their voting machines. And in some states they use different systems. Some states use paper ballots, and some do electronic with a paper backup, which is what North Carolina uses here. The idea behind the Electoral College was to separate citizens from the selection of the country's executive. So again, it was this sort of effort to give more power to the states and less to the people, and that was kind of the purpose there. The secondary goal here was to minimize the potential for corruption. So if you had voter fraud, massive voter fraud in one particular state, then it would only affect that state's electoral college votes. It wouldn't affect the entirety of the election there. So there have been many criticisms of the Electoral College. On 5 instances since we've used this system, it has produced a winner that did not win the popular vote. So, that's a situation where the person actually selected as president didn't have the majority of votes here. Obviously, these are going to be situations generally when the vote's pretty close, and we've had a lot of those recently. The first 3 times were actually in the 19th century, but we've had this happen a couple times recently. In 2000, which was... That was the first presidential election I voted in. Yep. That was Bush and Gore, of course. Al Gore won the popular vote. Bush, it was determined, won the Electoral College, and that came down to Florida and hanging chads, and maybe some of you are old enough to remember that. And then in 2016, you had Hillary Clinton actually won the popular vote, but Donald Trump won the Electoral College based on the number of Electoral College votes that he received, and so thus he won the election. These recent cases have led, to calls for a constitutional amendment to switch to a popular voting system here. Look, I can summarize in one bullet why this isn't happening. This system, has provided inherent, at least recently, benefit to Republicans because there have been 2 presidential elections that they've won that they would have otherwise lost had we relied on the popular vote. And that's not to in no means pick on Republicans here, because if the script were reversed here, I'm sure Democrats would oppose a change that would electorally disadvantage them as well. So it's very rational here why they don't want to do that. Obviously, we know to get a constitutional amendment passed is very difficult to do, so unlikely to happen. So that's why we have the system that we do, and it continues even though people generally hate it. Let's talk about the power of the presidency here. So the Constitution provides the power, so here's the interesting thing about the Constitution. It doesn't say a whole lot about what the president can do. There's a few enumerated powers here. So the president can make treaties with foreign nations. It has to do that with the consent of the Senate. So basically it has to advise the Senate of what he or she is doing. Appointing federal officers that we've talked about, including federal judges, again, with the consent of the Senate. And then issue pardons and reprieves. So there have been pardons and reprieves issued by most presidents. Usually, a lot of times it's as they're going out of office for a variety of different folks. We saw quite a few Trump supporters who had been convicted or charged with crimes that were received pardons as he was leaving office. I would expect when Biden is done that we'll see the same thing there. The thing about the presidency and studying it is it's very challenging. So I took a course in the American presidency in graduate school here. The really tricky thing is that a lot of the powers of the president that he or she executes are informal and not listed in the Constitution. And this includes the creation of the president's cabinet. So we'll talk about that and how it's not even something the Constitution actually calls for. So the president's cabinet is comprised of leaders of 15 governmental departments here that constitute a significant portion of the federal bureaucracy, so the different federal agencies that essentially carry out the day-to-day tasks of government. So you have, Congress passes laws, the president can issue executive orders and give sort of directions here. The courts can declare something constitutional or not, but you have to have people on the ground who are actually executing the federal government's, responsibilities. So I deal, for instance, with, the FAA considerably. In fact, this week I have Funny thing, I have the weirdest job. I am working with the FAA to develop a statistical model that predicts how long roses will live after you buy them at the grocery store, because it's actually very relevant to one of our clients who's trying to build cargo facilities and trying to make the argument that their facilities will be better for the survival of roses, and they'll last longer once you give them to your significant other or crush or whatever. So it's been a really weird week, but that's how I work with the FAA, among other, things. I work with Department of Transportation quite a bit. They actually issue a lot of grants for airports, and so I do the applications for those. My neighbor directly across the street here works for the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and I think there's a lot of people that work for these different alphabet departments here. There's a portion of the Constitution called the Opinion Clause that states the president may seek the advice of executive department heads, and that historically has been interpreted as I can have this cabinet of leaders here. The president has the power to appoint and remove cabinet leadership, which gives him or her tremendous power over the direction of that organization. As we'll talk about, the individual folks such as my neighbor here with the EPA, they cannot just be removed from office, and with good reason, right? My neighbor works for the EPA. He's a scientist. He generally likes the environment. If you had a president who didn't like the environment, they could say, everybody that likes the environment, get out of the EPA. I'm going to put my lawyer friends in here. We have systems, as we'll talk about, that prohibit that from happening. But the cabinet chairs who actually lead these departments are appointed and removed sort of at the whim of the president. Executive privilege here. So the president often claims the power of executive privilege, or the ability to withhold certain communications from the courts and Congress, so to do things in secret. This is not mentioned in the Constitution at all. This is something that has just been sort of generated and left to the courts to sort of decide. And generally the courts have sort of decided on this on a case-by-case basis here. In many cases, the president has been given executive privilege power, or the ability to protect their documents or emails and that sort of thing from the public. But in other cases, they've lost. So one of the most famous examples was U.S. versus Nixon. So this was during the Watergate scandal here, where the allegation was that President Nixon had sent political operatives to the Democratic Party offices at the Watergate Hotel to break in and steal their information. The court decided that the information that Nixon was holding on to as a part of his executive privilege was pertinent to a criminal case, and thus it didn't actually have protection. Recently, we've seen Donald Trump lose appeals to protect his personal records on very similar grounds, particularly related to the January 6th congressional committee here. So executive privilege, not a real thing in the sense that it's not in the Constitution, but it is real in the sense that the courts have recognized it previously based on circumstances. Executive orders here. So increasingly, the presidents have utilized executive orders to bypass Congress and issue directives to executive departments, and Congress really loves when they do this. So here's the deal, right? Congress is tasked with creating legislations, the laws of our lands. The president oversees the actual agencies that execute the will of the government, in the public, and actually do the things that affect us here. So what an executive order is essentially where the president goes to the cabinet head and says, I want you to do this thing. Sometimes these have been struck down by the court. Those are situations where the court has said, the president's overstepping, their bounds and creating de facto legislation here. But in other cases, the president's been allowed to do this. So, if let's see, Joe Biden. So Joe Biden is the commander in chief. So he heads up the Department of Defense. So he doesn't have to go to Congress to say, send an F-35 to shoot down that amateur weather balloon, and let's fire a $400,000 missile at something that cost a bunch of nerds $11 to build, which is allegedly what happened this week, which is pretty funny. So it doesn't require legislation. Same thing with Donald Trump to go down and say, we're going to, build this wall. And instead of using legislation, I am going to take money from, this agency, and we're going to apportion it to this, and the agencies are going to figure it out and build this wall for me, that sort of thing here. FDR has issued historically the most, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the most executive orders in history, over 3,700 executive orders here. You can see by comparison, Obama, Trump, and then Biden thus far here. If you remember the historical context here, this was during the Great Depression. FDR was also in office for 3 terms because that's before we had the term limits there. But FDR got tired of waiting on Congress to help the American people, and so he created all these programs such as the WPA and others that invested funds in infrastructure and created jobs, which, depending on how you look at it, was a good thing that stimulated the economy and sort of got us through the Great Depression here. Others think it was federal overreach, but he essentially did a go around Congress and created these different agencies to be able to execute what he wanted to do, and simply not worry about Congress. And obviously Congress wasn't too happy about it. Veto power here. So we mentioned this a couple times. So the president maintains the ability to check congressional power through the veto. So a president receives legislation from Congress. It's been agreed upon by the House and Senate. They've signed off. They've voted on it. The president has the power to veto it, reject it, and send it back to Congress here. Or the president can sign it, obviously, as well. So in some cases, the president says, I don't like this provision of it. I'm going to veto it. Or he doesn't even have to veto it. He can send it back and say, rewrite this thing and come it back to me. Sometimes he or she can veto it, just right out of the box and say, we're not going to do this. We see this at the state level as well, similar model. So one of the big things that happened in North Carolina in this last election cycle was that Republicans won enough state legislature seats to be able to essentially, as a voting bloc, override Governor Cooper. So Governor Cooper has essentially lost the veto power in some cases here. Congress can override a veto with a 2/3 majority in both chambers there. Naturally, given how close the partisan divide in Congress has been, that doesn't happen very often. Vetoes have actually declined over time in Congress, and there's a couple of reasons for it, but mostly it's because just given the information we have available to us, things like email and that sort of thing, members of Congress generally know how the president is going to vote on legislation. It's not a surprise. So where you see legislation being vetoed is largely, in a lot of cases, symbolic. So we know the president's going to veto this, but we want to show the American people that we did something, we acted on it, and then it falls on the president to do this. Trump vetoed 10 bills. Obama, George W. Bush each vetoed about 12. And the veto overrides, like I said, are even less common. So I made a reference to this before. So studying the presidency is really hard for a couple of reasons. And political science, in fact, the first day of the class when I took that in graduate school, that's what he said. It's going to be really hard for a couple of reasons here. One is what we call the small n problem. So in statistics, n it refers to sample, your sample population, and we only have 46 presidents to really sort of analyze. And a lot of those presidents were not working within the same historical context. It's hard to make a direct comparison to the decisions that sort of drive Joe Biden, as Andrew Jackson, for instance, here. And a lot of that historical data is really difficult to come by, right? Because a lot of it hasn't survived, or we don't have good records here. The other thing about this is that so much of presidential behavior is secretive. It occurs behind closed doors. It's agreements and sort of secret handshake type deals, and that doesn't produce a lot of data, right? You don't necessarily have a voting record tied to that. So you have to kind of have inside information to study the presidency, and that's why, from a political scientist standpoint, it's interesting. Very few political scientists study the presidency. It's one of the areas that's largely not covered, just because it's so hard to get data on the presidency. The one guy who did, and is actually sort of the leading sort of name in presidential scholarship, Richard Neustadt. He actually just passed away 5 or 6 years ago here. He wrote a book called Presidential Power and the Modern Presidents, and he wrote this back in, I believe, the 1980s, and it was updated various times with new administrations here. Neustadt argues that the president's true power is essentially the power of persuasion, to use his or her influence and public support to drive legislatures to do to carry out basically what he or she wants to see done, their agenda here. Neustadt points out the president's most successful in accomplishing their goals, the ones they set out sort of in the beginning of their presidency, are those that had the strongest ability to influence those around them. So historically, Lyndon Johnson is always the example, and in fact Neustadt used Johnson as sort of the benchmark for this here, because Johnson was just known to be incredibly influential with members of Congress and being able to directly speak to them. His whole thing is he would actually get right up into your face to to communicate with you, and was able to persuade a lot of legislators to behave differently than they otherwise would. So Neustadt says power of persuasion is the true power of the presidency. So let's talk about the bureaucracy here. As I mentioned, the day-to-day work of the government is typically carried out by the bureaucracy, and this is a term that's applied to non-elected portions of the government that manage various departments and functions. Each agency is typically led by a secretary, so that cabinet secretary I mentioned, chosen by the president. But the employees are, for the most part, civil servants, so they're hired based on merit. And they're purposely given strong protections to avoid political dismissals, because you want, the idea here is that you don't want my buddy at the EPA to be influenced by, what some politician is threatening his job over, right? You want him to do his job to the best of his ability here. The federal civil service is currently comprised of over 2.1 million employees, so it's quite large. Though the postal service there accounts for about 500,000 of those. That's the biggest source of government employees there. Let's go back in time and talk a little bit more about why we protect civil servants the way we do. So in the 1820s, Andrew Jackson, speaking of Andrew Jackson, filled bureaucratic agencies with political supporters and friends. Imagine that. This was known as the spoils system. It was marked by basically favors being given and rewarded by coveted roles. So if you do something for me, I'll appoint you a position, in this federal agency here. These were good paying jobs, stable jobs, and so a lot of people wanted them, particularly in the 1820s. This is similar to another term, patronage, is where state funds are utilized to support the businesses of individuals providing political support to government officials. About 1883, we have the Civil Service Reform Act. This followed, numerous scandals, sort of in that period, particularly after the Civil War, created this current merit-based system for agency hiring. Look, I started teaching this when I was 21 and was making $11,000 a year as a graduate teaching assistant and didn't have a whole lot of experience in the world. Fast forward to 2 decades later, I've spent 10 years working in government and now working alongside government. I wish, if this weren't public and I wasn't putting this into the universe here, I wish I could tell you some of the things that I've seen that make me very much a fan of these systems, and anything that's particularly in patronage that is specifically implemented to keep government agencies from being fair and not giving favors to those who do things for them or commit acts of bribery or that sort of thing. If you find me in some craft beer bar many years later after this class or something like that, maybe I can tell you more. So, more on protecting federal workers here. So, understanding this threat that was posed by the new president, basically coming in and upending agency staff, Congress passed the Pendleton Act in 1883 as well. So, this made it illegal to fire a federal worker for purely political reasons, and it required civil service exams. So now, as a system of merit, if you want one of these federal civil service jobs, you actually have to take an exam that you're scored on, and that's a component that's weighed in your application here. And that has created also the U.S. Civil Service Commission that basically enforces these protections here. So as a result of this, federal employees remain in their roles during a change of administration. Though the appointed leaders over those agencies often change here. Now, I presented this as, hey, this is a good thing, right? You're protecting federal workers. I feel like it's necessary to present the other side, which is, often a criticism of government workers in general, which is that it is very difficult to terminate them or remove them from a job. It's very common, for instance, for federal workers to be in a role for 20, 30 years, retire. Which is good for them because they get paid well and they get a good pension. Critics would suggest that doesn't lead to a lot of innovation or new ideas, and it doesn't necessarily encourage a strong work ethic to know that you can't be fired. I am speaking through my best friend's wife, who works for one of the alphabet agencies for the federal government, and is extremely frustrated by having employees who she can't fire and who know they can't be fired and generally don't do anything as a result. I have hired people as a government employee. My situation when I worked in airports was slightly different because I didn't have protection, and I have been fired, that sort of thing. But I've also been in government agencies and worked for airports where you have people that have been there 20, 30 years, haven't done anything differently, don't want to do anything differently, and sort of fight anything that might be different or challenge them. So there's definitely credence to that sort of side of it as well. And you'll have critics who say that this isn't a great system because it doesn't produce the best workers and the best federal government we can have. So two sort of conflicting kind of perspectives there. Let's talk about the type of bureaucratic agencies here. There are 15 cabinet departments that I listed on slide 8 here that are, basically over the most critical federal departments. They also have the most scrutiny over their actions here. You have a variety of different independent executive agencies, regulatory agencies as well, that have a more narrow scope. So I talked about the FAA, that'd be a good example. Environmental Protection Agency, CIA, for instance, are all these independent agencies here. You also have government-run corporations, a couple of them notably, that are quasi-business in their practice. The two most notable there are the U.S. Postal Service and Amtrak. So the U.S. Postal Service, back way back when, it was decided that, look, if we have different companies competing to deliver the mail, people are going to have like 4 different mailboxes, and it'll be, completely just chaotic here. And this was at a time for many of you, in fact, even my age, it's hard to remember a time when the mail actually mattered. But it does. If you've been to, I don't know if you've been to a post office recently, but it's generally a lot of our senior citizen neighbors and friends that are there. For the most of us, we don't, do a whole lot, with the mail system there, but early in American history, before email and that sort of thing, it was critically important. Amtrak is similar as well. So for moving passengers, it was decided that having one rail system that didn't have to compete would ensure safety. Passenger rail is not terribly profitable as an enterprise here, so it is basically subsidized by the government because it provides an economic service, right, to be able to get people from one place to another. If you haven't, and I'll make your code word this week can be Amtrak, Amtrak. It amazes me because I grew up in Texas where we have no public transportation of any sort. That's kind of a sinful, if you will, where I grew up. So I'm always fascinated by it, and I end up having to go to Charlotte fairly often for work or to see friends and that sort of thing. And I totally take the North Carolina trains, the Amtrak trains that run between Raleigh and Charlotte. They actually go further than that, and they are awesome. It takes about the same amount of time to drive than it would to drive, and I can work on my laptop. Look, I work in the airline industry. I hate flying. Riding on a train and having all that leg room is magical. So if you need to go down to Charlotte next time, I would suggest the train. It's actually really nice. Just pick up an Uber when you get there. It's pretty cool. And actually, a lot of college students, when I ride the train, it ends up being a lot of college students. But Amtrak, I digress, is your code word for this lecture. Almost done here. So just 2 more slides, I think, here left. One of the things I want to mention is this bureaucratic inefficiency theory. So one of the things bureaucratic agencies are often accused of is being very inefficient, not being able to get things done. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But there's a prevailing sort of theory in political science that actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it. So you have a lot of these agencies that regulate certain industries, and those industries generally don't want to be regulated. And so they'll fight through their members of Congress to not allow that agency to be created in the first place. So good example, I'll go back to the FAA since I know it. The early airlines did not want to be regulated or told what to do or how to run their business. There was a midair collision over the Grand Canyon in the 1950s, some time period here, where that was where the government stepped in and said, yeah, we got to regulate airspace. And that led to the creation of the FAA there. So the airlines, through their members of Congress, realized, we're not going to win this fight. They're going to create this agency that's going to regulate us. But if we give in and vote to support this, we can trade that for actually dictating what the agency can do. So according to bureaucratic inefficiency theory, the idea here is that we'll use, for instance, the EPA and the auto manufacturers. Okay, we'll let you create an EPA, but we want to be active in regulating what they can do. So the idea is that the industries that are being regulated actually have a say in their creation and basically design them to be as inefficient as possible so they don't end up being very effective at their jobs. So that's a theory that It's quite prevalent in political science as to why a lot of these agencies, like the EPA, for instance, my neighbor with the EPA will tell you that, when in Jordan Lake, dogs were dying because they were drinking the water, and there's some algae bloom in Jordan Lake that will kill your dog. And all of a sudden, he said all these, community leaders and stuff were coming to him in his department and saying, "Why didn't you tell us about this?" And they said, "Well, we did. We published all these reports, but we weren't allowed to go public with it because, our agency leadership told us, we couldn't," that sort of thing. So, unfortunate there. If you have a dog, don't let him swim in Jordan Lake like this cute puppy here that I'm using to distract you from the fact that studying the bureaucracy is not terribly fun. Fortunately, though, we're on the last slide here. So there are issues in regulation, and this is huge. I recommend, if you haven't seen the movie The Big Short, it's actually really well done and sort of shows in a very frustrating fashion why this is so complicated here. It's a little bit disconcerting when you're a young person and you come out into the world as an adult and you say, man, I'm sure all these experts know what they're doing and they're making all these decisions that keep the world running and safe and all that sort of thing. And then and maybe I'm a bit jaded by age, but then you realize, no, that's not the case at all. So one of the principal challenges is that the ties between these agencies, bureaucratic agencies, and the industries are regulating are often very tight. In fact, there's a lot of people who go back and forth, maybe those that have worked for the regulating agency, and then lo and behold, they get hired by the firm that they were regulating. Examples of this, Department of Energy, for instance, has long been accused of being too close to energy companies. There is a accusation that prior to the BP oil spill, that basically the Department of Energy was very lax because they were essentially in bed with the energy companies and the oil producers there. And you could see that through the fact that so many employees at BP had previously worked for the Department of Energy. Again, this is a claim here. Others have suggested recently, again, I'll go back to the FAA, because if you looked at the 737 MAX, the accidents that occurred there, the accusation levied upon the FAA was that they were too close to these airlines that were flying these planes. And particularly the accusation against Southwest was that Southwest didn't want to have to undergo the retraining of their 737 pilots to fly this new airplane, and so they essentially lobbied the FAA to make it to where the 737 MAX didn't need additional training. They basically got a booklet or something like that, and they just had to sign that they got the book. Whereas the pilot unions, in response, after all this happened, said, no, we should have gotten simulator training and specialized type rating training for this new system. So that's just a recent example there. So it's a very tricky situation there, and I wish I knew what the solution was, but largely I don't. So on that fun note, we're done with the presidency and bureaucracy. That brings us to the end of the first half course lectures. Hope you enjoyed that to the extent you can. Big takeaways here. Presidential powers are pretty vague, but we do know that the president uses their power of persuasion to get things done in Congress. And then the president executes a lot of power through the bureaucratic agencies that he or she directly regulates. So, like I said, I hope you enjoy it. The next half of the class will focus more on behavior. So we'll talk about things like voting in elections and campaigns and public opinion and all that sort of fun stuff there. Thanks so much, guys.